She's dead. Mark it. We move now. Nobody argued. Nobody pushed back. Nobody walked the 2 miles back through enemy fire to check. Rachel Carter heard those words crackling through a dying radio, lying face down in her own blood, with 2 broken ribs and a rifle she could barely lift. Her commander's voice, calm, final, certain. He hadn't seen her body, hadn't sent anyone to confirm, hadn't waited 30 seconds longer than his fear told him to. He just decided she was dead and drove away. She was still breathing when he said it. She was still fighting when he left. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, please take 2 seconds to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, because I genuinely want to see how far Rachel's story has traveled. Now let's get into it. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield after the explosions stop. It is not peaceful. It is not calm. It is the silence of something deeply wrong, the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next, waiting to see who is still standing and who is not. Rachel Carter heard that silence from the burning wreckage of the second vehicle in the convoy, and her first thought before the pain registered, before her brain had even fully processed what had just happened, was not about herself. Her first thought was, who else made it out? That was Rachel Carter in a single moment. That was 30 years of life compressed into one instinct. Before she checked her own body for damage, before she assessed whether she could move, before she even allowed herself to feel the white-hot pain radiating from her left side where 2 of her ribs had been cracked by the force of the blast, she was already thinking about the people around her. That was the thing about Rachel that nobody fully understood until they served with her. Most soldiers, when you put them under enough pressure, eventually start making decisions based on survival, their own survival, first and foremost, because that's what every human brain is wired to do. But Rachel Carter had somehow rewired herself. She had spent years in training and in the field until the instinct to protect others had become as automatic as breathing. It was a gift. And on this particular night, deep in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, it was also the reason she was still alive. She had been thrown clear of the vehicle, not far, but far enough. When the second vehicle in the convoy hit the pressure plate buried in the mountain road, the force of the explosion had sent Rachel tumbling into the shallow ravine at the edge of the trail. The cold stone had torn through her uniform and opened a cut along her jawline. The impact had cracked 2 ribs on her left side. Her ears were ringing so badly that the world felt underwater, distant and distorted. But she was conscious and she could move. She pulled herself up to the edge of the ravine and looked back at the convoy. The second vehicle was completely gone, not damaged, gone. The explosion had been enormous, far larger than anything a standard IED would produce. Someone had planted something specifically designed to destroy armored vehicles, and they had planted it perfectly. The first vehicle had been hit by something else, rocket fire, Rachel thought, from the angle of the damage, and it had skidded sideways across the road and caught fire. Through the smoke, she could see shapes moving, but she couldn't tell from this distance whether they were her people or the enemy. The third and fourth vehicles, which had been trailing at a distance, had stopped. She could hear voices. She could hear engines. She pressed herself flat against the stone and tried to make her ringing ears work harder, tried to separate the sounds into something meaningful. And then she heard a voice she recognized. It was Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, her convoy commander, and he was shouting into a radio handset with the controlled urgency of a man who had been in bad situations before and knew how to function in them. She couldn't hear everything he was saying. The ringing was still too bad. The wind was picking up off the mountain, but she caught fragments. Multiple vehicles destroyed, confirming casualties. Request immediate extraction at. She started to move toward him. She had just pushed herself up to her knees when the second wave of fire started. The enemy had been waiting. Of course they had been waiting. They had planned this attack with precision, which meant they had also planned for the possibility that some soldiers would survive the initial strike. The ambush wasn't just the explosives buried in the road. The ambush was everything that came after. Automatic weapons fire erupted from at least 3 positions on the high ground above the road. Rachel heard the distinctive crack and thump of rounds passing too close and dropped back into the ravine. She pressed herself flat and made herself small and breathed through the pain in her ribs and waited. The firefight was brief. That was the worst part. It was over too quickly. She heard Webb's voice again, shouting orders, and then she heard something that made her stomach drop, the sound of engines accelerating. Not incoming engines, departing ones. The third and fourth vehicles were moving. They were moving away. Rachel pressed herself harder against the stone and told herself she was wrong. She told herself she was misreading the sounds, that the ringing in her ears was distorting everything, that Marcus Webb would never pull those vehicles back and leave her behind. She told herself that until the engine sounds faded completely and the mountain road went quiet again, and then she was alone. She stayed still for a long time. In survival situations, stillness is often the most important tool you have, and Rachel knew this better than almost anyone. Moving too soon, reacting before you fully assessed what's around you, that's how people die. So she lay flat in the ravine with her face pressed against the cold stone, and she listened and she breathed, and she let her brain start to work. Enemy voices, close maybe 200 meters up the slope. She could hear them moving, the crunch of boots on loose rock, the occasional bark of a command being passed down the line. They were searching the wreckage. They were looking for survivors. She very slowly turned her head and looked at the road above her. Two men had come down from the high ground and were moving through the burning vehicles. They were armed, carrying AKMs, and they were thorough. She could see them checking each vehicle, pulling at debris, shining lights into corners. They were professional. This wasn't a random ambush by a local militia. These people knew what they were doing. Rachel did a mental inventory of what she had. Her rifle and M4 was still in her hands. By some miracle, she had been holding it when the blast hit, and she had managed to keep hold of it during the fall. She checked it as carefully as she could, without moving too much, running her fingers along the receiver and the barrel, checking the magazine by feel. It was functional. The barrel was clear. She had one full magazine and two partial magazines in her vest, maybe 60 rounds total. Her medical kit was still attached to her vest, which was good. She was going to need it. She had a knife. She had a tourniquet. She had a compass which was attached to her wristband and had survived the blast. She had a small flashlight, which she would not be using anytime soon. She had 3 days' worth of compressed ration bars, which she had been carrying as emergency supplies. She had a personal locator beacon that she immediately checked the casing was cracked, and when she hit the test button, nothing happened. She had no working radio. She had no satellite phone. She had no way to communicate with anyone. She was 240 kilometers inside enemy territory, with broken ribs, in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, in the middle of the night, and her own command had already driven away. She lay in that ravine for 6 hours before she moved. She did not sleep. Sleep was not an option, not with enemy patrols working through the wreckage above her. But she rested, because rest was something she could control, and she used the time to plan. The most dangerous thing she could do right now was panic. She knew this from training, from experience, from watching other soldiers in bad moments make decisions that cost them everything, because they let fear override their thinking. Panic burned through your energy. Panic made you move when you should be still. Panic made you loud when silence was survival. Rachel Carter did not panic. She thought about the geography. She had studied the maps for this mission until she could reconstruct them from memory, which was standard procedure for any reconnaissance specialist worth the title. She knew that the nearest position with any chance of friendly forces was roughly 200 kilometers to the southwest, a mountainous, brutal 200 kilometers that would take her through some of the most hostile terrain in the region. She also knew that the enemy forces operating in this area were organized, well-equipped, and would now be specifically looking for American survivors. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she needed. She thought about the difference between the two and how to close that gap. And she made her first decision. She would not move toward friendly territory. Not yet. Moving immediately was exactly what the enemy would expect. Survivors run. Survivors retreat. That's what every tactical textbook says, and the people hunting her had read those same textbooks. Rachel was going to do something else. She was going to disappear. When the first gray light of dawn started to soften the darkness above the mountain, she moved. She moved slowly, staying in the deepest shadows, using the terrain the way she had been trained to use it, not fighting the landscape, but becoming part of it. She moved away from the road, away from the wreckage, away from the direction of friendly territory, and she climbed. In survival training, there's a concept called the unexpected position, the idea that in a pursuit situation, the pursued should always try to occupy the position that the pursuer has already dismissed as illogical. The enemy would expect a surviving American soldier to be running southwest, away from danger. They would establish search patterns based on that assumption. Rachel went northeast. deeper into the mountains, away from where they were looking. She found a position before full daylight, a narrow overhang in the rock face, shielded on three sides, with a clear view of the valley below. She squeezed herself into it, pulled a piece of the landscape over herself, a broken branch, a handful of loose stone, and she became invisible. And she waited. From her position, she could watch the enemy search operation unfold in the valley below. She counted vehicles, 7 trucks, all military grade. She counted people, at least 40, possibly more. They were organized into teams, sweeping the terrain in parallel lines, moving in the direction of friendly territory, moving exactly where she wasn't. She watched for 3 hours. She counted their movements, timed their patterns, noted which positions they checked twice and which positions they skipped. She memorized the schedule of their radio checks. She watched the way they coordinated with each other and noted the moments when that coordination broke down, the pauses, the confusion, the small failures of communication that happened when any large group tried to move through difficult terrain. She was building a picture, not of how to escape, not yet, of how they operated, of where they were weak. It was around mid-morning when she heard the radio transmission that changed everything. Her radio was broken. Her locator beacon was broken. But her ears were working fine, and the enemy soldiers below her were not as careful about radio discipline as they should have been. A pair of them had stopped to rest maybe 50 meters below her position, and one of them was talking into his radio in a regional dialect she had spent 2 years learning to understand. She pressed herself flat against the stone and listened to every word. The transmission was to someone higher up the chain. Someone was asking for a status report on the American survivor, and the man below her was reporting that the initial search had found no trace, but they were continuing. Then came the part that made her blood run cold. The voice on the other end of the radio said, "Command is offering substantial reward for the American taken alive. She is a specialist. She has knowledge they want. Repeat, they want her alive. Adjust your orders accordingly." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Alive was worse than dead. Alive meant interrogation. Alive meant they would not stop looking, not now. Not in a week, not until they found her. And alive meant that everything she knew, the classified mission parameters, the unit positions, the intelligence they had been sent to gather, was at risk. She pressed her back against the cold rock and stared up at the small strip of sky visible above her and thought very carefully about what she was going to do. She could feel the cracked ribs with every breath. Not sharp pain, not yet, but a deep, grinding pressure that told her the bones were moving against each other. If she let this go untreated, infection was a risk. Pneumonia was a risk. Internal bleeding, depending on exactly how the ribs had fractured, was also a risk she couldn't rule out. She opened her medical kit and did what she could. She wrapped her ribs as tightly as she could manage without losing mobility, tight enough to stabilize, not tight enough to restrict her breathing. She cleaned the cut on her jaw and sealed it with the butterfly strips in her kit. She swallowed 2 ibuprofen tablets from her emergency supply and reminded herself to be careful with those. She had maybe 16 left, and she was going to need them. Then she ate half a ration bar, just half. She didn't know how long she was going to need these to last. And she started to think, not about escape, not about rescue. Those were things that might happen, things she could hope for, but they were outside her control. The only things worth thinking about right now were the things she could actually control. She could control her position. She could control her movement. She could control her actions. The enemy wanted her captured. They would keep looking until they found her. That was a fact she couldn't change. But she could change what they found when they looked. She could change what the terrain looked like, what the intelligence picture looked like, what the operational environment felt like for the people hunting her. 40 soldiers, 7 vehicles, organized search patterns, radio discipline that was imperfect but not terrible. She had 60 rounds, cracked ribs, 3 days of food, and the particular kind of mind that didn't stop working even when every reasonable part of a person would have given up. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about him climbing into that vehicle and driving away, and she let herself feel that the full weight of that betrayal because she had found that suppressing things was dangerous. You needed to feel them, place them somewhere real, and then move past them. So she felt it. She felt the shock of it and the fury of it and the raw, throat-closing grief of knowing that the people who were supposed to come back for her had decided she wasn't worth coming back for. She gave herself 2 minutes for all of that. Then she put it somewhere in the back of her mind where it couldn't interfere with her thinking. and she focused on the problem in front of her. It was around midday when the enemy search teams below her made a mistake. It was a small mistake, the kind of mistake that anyone watching from outside might not even notice. One of the vehicle drivers left his engine running while his team dismounted to check a ridgeline. Running engines were standard procedure. You wanted to be able to move quickly. You didn't want to risk a cold start failure at a critical moment. Rachel understood the logic. What the driver didn't account for was the gradient of the slope where he had parked, and the fact that the vehicle's handbrake was old and worn. She didn't intervene. She didn't have to. She just watched as the vehicle began to roll, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, down the slope it had been parked on. She watched the controlled chaos that followed the shouting, the running, the two soldiers who tried to jump into the moving vehicle and nearly got run over, the commander screaming into his radio, the distraction that rippled through the entire search operation like a stone dropped in still water. For approximately 4 minutes, every eye in the valley below her was on that runaway vehicle. Rachel used those 4 minutes. She moved from her position, crossed 40 meters of exposed terrain she would never have risked otherwise, and dropped into a rocky depression 2 levels up the mountain, a position with an even better view of the valley, with more cover, with a direct sightline to the main road that the enemy vehicles were using. When the chaos below finally settled, the vehicle had been recovered, more or less intact from the bottom of a shallow gully. She was already gone from where they would have looked for her. She was becoming a ghost. Over the next 48 hours, a pattern began to emerge. During daylight, Rachel was completely still. She occupied positions that gave her observation of the enemy search operation while providing cover so complete that she was effectively invisible. She watched, she counted, cataloged everything she could see and everything she could hear. At night, she moved. She moved with the particular discipline of someone who is trained for exactly this: slow, deliberate, always checking before taking a step, always aware of the sound profile she was creating, always thinking 3 moves ahead. She moved toward better positions, positions that gave her more information, positions from which she could see more of what the enemy was doing. She was not running. She was learning. On the 3rd day, she found their supply cache. It was not well hidden. They had buried it under a cairn of rocks about 300 meters from the road, the kind of cache that a local fighter would recognize, but that was meant to be invisible to aerial observation. Rachel had found it by following a pattern in the foot traffic she had been observing 3 different times. She had watched a small group of fighters break away from the main search operation, head to a specific point on the hillside, and return 20 minutes later. The 3rd time it happened, she noted the exact bearing and stored it. She found the cache at just before midnight on the 3rd day. It contained food, ammunition, and medical supplies. She took what she needed. She was careful and precise about what she took, not everything. Nothing that would be immediately obvious. She took 2 days' worth of the locally sourced food that was stored there because her ration bars were nearly gone. She took 3 morphine syringes from the medical supplies because her ribs were getting worse and she needed to manage the pain carefully over what might be a very long time. She left everything else exactly as she had found it, almost exactly, because before she left, she did something else. She took a small piece of equipment from her kit, a battery-powered signal device the size of a cigarette lighter, designed to emit an intermittent tone on a specific radio frequency. It was meant to be used as a personal locator, but the battery in her beacon was dead. The device itself still worked. She buried it in the cache 8 inches beneath the top layer. It would emit its signal for approximately 72 hours before the battery failed. She had just created a problem for the people hunting her, a signal that would come from exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time, pulling resources and attention in a direction that suited her needs perfectly. She was 3 days into an impossible situation, badly hurt, alone, running low on everything, and she had just started fighting back. That night, she allowed herself one moment of something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it. She lay on her back on a flat section of rock, out of sight of anything and anyone, and she looked up at the stars, brilliant and sharp up above the mountain, the way they only get when you're far from any artificial light. She thought about the people who might be looking for her. She thought about whether anyone back at command had questioned the KIA designation. She thought about what it would take for someone to realize they'd gotten it wrong, that she wasn't dead, that she was out here, that she needed someone to come. She allowed herself to think about that for exactly as long as it took her to count 50 stars. Then she rolled onto her side, winced at the grinding pressure in her ribs, and started planning her next move. Because Rachel Carter had made a decision. She was not going to wait to be found. She was going to give them a reason to look. She just needed to survive long enough to do it. And survival, quiet, disciplined, invisible survival, was the one thing she had always been better at than anyone. The enemy had deployed 40 soldiers to find one woman. In 72 hours, that number would double. Not because they were getting closer, because she was making them afraid. She had gone from running to hunting without anyone understanding exactly when that moment of transformation had happened. Not even Rachel could have pinpointed it precisely. It had been somewhere in those long hours of stillness, somewhere in the watching and counting and planning, somewhere in the moment she had looked at the valley, full of soldiers searching for her, and understood, really understood that they were looking for a survivor. And she had stopped being a survivor. She had become something else entirely. The mountains closed around her in the dark, cold, and vast and absolute. And Rachel Carter, whom her own command had declared dead, moved through them like something the mountains themselves had decided to shelter, like something the night had chosen, like a soldier who would not give the enemy the satisfaction of being right. She had given herself 2 minutes to feel the betrayal, 2 minutes to let it move through her like a wave, the fury, the disbelief, the raw animal grief of knowing the people who were supposed to come back for her had made a choice, and that choice was to leave her for dead. She had felt every second of those 2 minutes, and then she had put it away, because Marcus Webb had made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, not a logistical error. A fundamental mistake about the nature of the woman he had driven away from. He had looked at the situation and calculated that Rachel Carter was finished. He had run the math and decided the numbers didn't add up in her favor. He had made the coldest possible assessment of her chances and determined that she wasn't worth the risk of going back. What he had failed to account for was the fact that Rachel Carter had never once in her life done what the math said she should. She moved before dawn on the 4th day, and she moved with a precision that would have surprised anyone watching if anyone had been watching, which was exactly the point. The enemy search operation had expanded overnight. She had counted the lights, listened to the engines, tracked the radio traffic she could intercept, and calculated that they had brought in at least 30 additional fighters since the day before. The commander of the search operation was getting pressure from above. The reward for her capture had apparently been increased. She knew this because the soldiers in the valley below were talking too loudly, the way people talk when they're anxious, when someone above them is angry, when the mission isn't going the way it was supposed to. She filed all of that away and used it. The signal device she had buried in the enemy supply cache had been transmitting for approximately 18 hours. Sometime in the next 24, someone was going to notice that signal. When they did, they were going to pull resources toward that location, which was exactly where Rachel didn't need them focused. She had bought herself a window. The question was what to do with it. The answer, she had decided, was communication. She had no working radio. She had no satellite phone. She had no locator beacon. But she had been a reconnaissance specialist for 4 years. And reconnaissance specialists didn't rely on electronics alone. You used what the environment gave you. You used what the enemy gave you. And you used what you knew about the people who might be looking for you if any of them were looking, which was a question she had not yet resolved in her own mind. She had been listed as KIA. She understood that, which meant that from command's perspective, there was no missing soldier to find. There was no open search. There was no team being assembled to go back into enemy territory for a body that had already been written off. If anyone was going to change that picture, she had to do it herself. The problem was doing it without getting herself killed in the process. She had been watching the enemy's communication patterns for 3 days. She knew when their radio checks happened. She knew which frequencies they were using for local coordination. She knew that somewhere in their operation, there was a radio with enough range to reach a frequency that American intelligence assets would be monitoring, because American intelligence assets monitored everything all the time. And what she needed was not a direct communication to a friendly unit. What she needed was an anomaly, something strange enough in the signal environment that someone somewhere would look twice. She had a plan. It was not a good plan. It was the plan she had instead of a good plan, which was the only kind of planning that mattered in her current situation. She needed to get close to one of the enemy vehicles. She spent the morning watching. She was still, she was patient, and she watched with the focused attention of someone who understood That observation was not passive. Watching was working. Watching was the activity that would keep her alive when everything else had failed. She watched the patrol patterns. She watched the timing. She watched the specific vehicle that had been designated as the communications hub for the search operation. She could tell by the antenna configuration, by the volume of traffic, by the way the commander kept returning to it throughout the day. That vehicle, she needed to get to that vehicle. The gap came in the early afternoon when the patrol that had been covering the western approach to the road rotated back to the main position for resupply. There were 12 minutes. She had timed 3 previous rotations to be certain, during which the western approach had reduced coverage. Not zero coverage. And reduced was enough. She moved. The thing people didn't understand about moving through contested terrain was that the danger wasn't the enemy you could see. The enemy you could see was a known quantity, a fixed point in your picture of the world, something you could plan around. The danger was the enemy. You couldn't see the secondary position, the lone sentry, the fighter who had decided on his own to cover a different angle than the one he had been assigned. Rachel moved through the terrain with her whole body functioning as a sensor. Every step placed with deliberate care. Every pause long enough to listen, to feel the air, to read the silence for what it was telling her. She was breathing through the pain in her ribs, which had worsened over the last 24 hours, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but persistently, the way serious injuries worked when you kept asking your body to do things it was telling you it wasn't ready for. She got within 80 meters of the communications vehicle, and she stopped, because there was a man sitting on a rock between her and the vehicle, facing almost directly toward her, and he had a rifle across his knees and the particular kind of alert posture that told her he was not half asleep like the sentries she had been watching all morning. He was awake. He was paying attention. And if she moved another 3 meters in any direction, she was going to be visible. She froze and did the math. She could take him. At this range, in this light, with a clean shot, she could take him before he got a round off. But the sound of a shot would end everything. Suppressed weapons were for people who had access to equipment she didn't. An unsuppressed M4 round in this mountain valley would echo for a mile in every direction, and within 30 seconds, she would have every fighter in the search operation converging on her position. She could not take him. She waited. He shifted on his rock. He reached into a pocket and came out with something she couldn't see what. He sat there for a moment, perfectly still, and then he turned his head and looked directly at her position. She stopped breathing. The moment stretched out long enough that it had physical weight, long enough that she could feel her pulse in the cut on her jaw, long enough that she counted her remaining options and found them thin. He looked away. He had looked right at her hiding position and seen nothing, because she had done everything right: the angle, the cover, the discipline of absolute stillness. He had looked at her and seen the mountain. She let the air out of her lungs so slowly that it made no sound at all. 20 minutes later, a fighter came to relieve him. They spoke briefly. She caught fragments, something about the search expanding to a new grid sector, and the first man walked back toward the main position. The new sentry was younger, less settled, and within 5 minutes he had repositioned himself around the other side of the vehicle to get out of the wind. Rachel moved. She covered the remaining 80 meters in less than 4 minutes, which was fast for the terrain, which meant she was taking risks she knew she shouldn't be taking, which meant the pain in her ribs was doing exactly what pain was supposed to do, telling her body to slow down while her mind overrode it. She reached the vehicle. The radio handset was mounted inside on the passenger side. The vehicle was unlocked. Why would you lock a vehicle in what you believed was a secured search perimeter? She eased the door open, inch by inch, watching the young sentry around the corner of the vehicle, and reached inside. She found what she was looking for in 11 seconds. The radio was set to local coordination frequency. She needed to change it briefly for no more than 30 seconds to an emergency monitoring frequency that she knew American intelligence assets would be scanning. She didn't need to transmit a full message. She didn't need to explain her situation. She needed to say enough that someone listening would understand that something impossible was happening. She changed the frequency. She pressed the transmit button. And she spoke in a low, flat, controlled voice that was quieter than the wind but precise as a blade. This is Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter, 3rd Reconnaissance, identification number 337 Alpha Niner. I am mobile. I am inside hostile search operation. This is not a drill. This is not a recording. Carter is alive. Frequency shift to follow. She gave a second frequency. She released the transmit button. She changed the radio back to its original setting with the speed of someone who has practiced this motion until it is automatic. She eased the door shut. She moved. She was 30 meters from the vehicle when the young sentry came back around the corner. He did not see her. She made it back to cover before the next patrol rotation. And somewhere, in a signals intelligence facility that she would never see, in a room full of people who were looking for anomalies in the electronic environment, a recording of a 30-second transmission was flagged for review. She didn't know that yet. She had no way of knowing whether anyone had heard her. She had no way of knowing whether the frequency had been monitored, whether the recording had survived the relay, whether the word alive had reached anyone with the authority or the willingness to act on it. She had done what she could do. Now she had to keep herself alive long enough for it to matter. She went back to the mountain. She went back to stillness and watching, and the grinding discipline of survival. And she thought about what she had learned in those 90 seconds near the enemy vehicle, because nothing was wasted, not time, not risk, not information. The fighters were being redirected, a new grid sector, which meant the search was moving not toward her, but in a direction that suggested they were working out from the short site in a systematic pattern. They hadn't found the signal device yet, which meant she still had time before that disruption hit them. She was inside their decision cycle. She understood what they were doing before they did it, or very nearly so. And she had just introduced a piece of information into the environment that no one on either side had expected. She had announced herself, which was either the most tactically sound thing she had done since the ambush or the most dangerous. She wouldn't know which for a while. The next 3 days were the hardest of her life. Not because the danger increased, though it did. Not because the searches intensified, though they did that too. The hardest part was the silence inside her own head, the silence that came when you had done everything you could do, and there was nothing left but waiting, and waiting was the thing that broke people. Rachel knew this about herself. She had learned it in training, in the isolation exercises that were designed to find the edges of a person's psychological endurance. The instructors who ran those exercises had told her class something she had never forgotten. The body can survive almost anything. It's the mind that gives up first. Your only job is to keep the mind busy. So she kept her mind busy. She inventoried her supplies with the precision of an accountant. She had 2 morphine syringes left. She had used one during the worst of the second night, when the pain in her ribs had reached a level that was affecting her ability to function, and she had done the math carefully before using it because she couldn't afford the cognitive dulling that came with the drug at a full dose. So she had used half. She had food for perhaps another 2 days if she was disciplined. She had approximately 40 rounds of ammunition remaining after a careful recount. She had water. She had found a source on the second day of her movement and purified it with the tablets from her medical kit. And she had not been reckless with it, but the supply was finite, and she would need to find another source within 48 hours. She cataloged all of this. She ran the numbers. She made contingency plans for contingency plans. And she watched the search operation change around her, because something had shifted. She noticed it first in the patterns, the way the patrol timing had changed, the way the vehicles were repositioning, the way the radio traffic had intensified. Something had happened that she wasn't aware of. Something had changed in the intelligence picture. The search operation, which had been methodical and expanding, suddenly contracted. Fighters who had been spread across a wide grid were being pulled back toward a central position. The communications vehicle, the one she had accessed 3 days earlier, was moved twice in the same afternoon, which was unusual. They were reacting to something. She thought about the signal device buried in the cache. She thought about whether it had finally been discovered. She thought about whether her radio transmission had caused some kind of response in the enemy's awareness of the situation. And then just before dark, she intercepted a fragment of radio traffic that answered her question. The transmission was brief, in the same regional dialect she had been listening to for days. The voice was tense, the particular tension of someone reporting bad news up the chain. The cache was found to be compromised. The device was an American signal unit. The woman has been in our supply position. She is not running. Repeat, she is not running. She is operating against us. Request guidance. There was a long pause on the radio. We do not know. Days, possibly. Another pause. Double the search. She is no longer a survivor. She is an operator. Treat her accordingly. Rachel processed this with the methodical calm she had been maintaining for the better part of a week, and underneath that calm, She felt something she recognized but had not expected in this specific moment. She felt satisfaction, not pride, not triumph. Just the quiet, deep satisfaction of someone who has been underestimated, who has been written off, declared dead, abandoned, dismissed, and has just forced the people who underestimated her to recalibrate at great cost to themselves. They had come into these mountains looking for one injured American soldier. They had found something they didn't have a category for. That shift the moment when they stopped calling her a survivor and started calling her an operator was the moment everything changed. Because operators got handled differently. Operators got resources deployed against them that survivors did not. Operators were taken seriously. Operators were in a very particular sense respected. She had earned that word in the hardest possible way. But it also meant the danger had just increased significantly, and she needed to adjust. She moved that night farther than she had moved in any single night since the ambush, pushing through terrain that was brutal on her ribs but necessary for the new distances she needed between herself and the search operation. She moved northeast, then doubled back southwest, then cut north again in a pattern that made logical sense to no one, because it was not designed to make logical sense. It was designed to make her track impossible to read, to make her movements look chaotic when in fact they were precisely controlled. She was on the sixth day when she found the thing that changed her understanding of her situation entirely. She had been working her way along a ridgeline above the valley when she came across evidence of previous occupation, not enemy, not her own people. Old, a decade old, maybe more. The remains of a position that someone had built and used and abandoned, high in the rocks where the view down into the valley was comprehensive and the cover from above was excellent. She settled into it and she looked at what the previous occupant had left behind. Communication equipment, old, obsolete by any current standard. But the components, specific components, were there. And Rachel Carter, who had spent 4 years in reconnaissance with a secondary specialty in signals intelligence, looked at those components and began to understand what they could do if you knew how to assemble them correctly. She was not an engineer. She was not an electronic specialist, but she knew enough. She had learned enough, and she had approximately 72 hours, and nothing but time and necessity driving her. She started working. The pain in her ribs was constant now. She had used her last full morphine syringe the previous evening. The half dose had stopped being effective, and she had needed her hands steady for what she was doing, and steady hands required a level of pain management she could not achieve without it. That meant she had no more narcotics. She had ibuprofen. She had the discipline she had built over years of training, and she had the particular focused tunnel that you entered when you were doing something with your hands that required all of your attention. She worked. While she worked, she thought about the signals intelligence facility she had transmitted to 3 days earlier. She thought about whether anyone had acted on what she had sent. She thought about what the chain of events would look like if they had the verification process, the skepticism, the debate about whether a transmission from inside an active enemy search operation was genuine or a deception. She thought about how long that process would take and whether she would still be in a position to be found by the time it concluded. She did not let herself think about the alternative. On the second day of working on the equipment, something happened that she had not planned for. A patrol found her ridgeline. Not her specific position, they found the ridgeline, the approach to it, and they started working their way up from the valley floor with the particular systematic method that told her this was not a random patrol but a deliberate sweep. Someone had made a decision based on something they knew or suspected that this ridgeline needed to be checked. She had 40 rounds. She had a position. She had the high ground. She also had a half-assembled communications device that she could not take with her and could not afford to leave. She looked at the patrol, which was about 300 meters below her and moving steadily. She looked at her equipment. She looked at the patrol again. And she made a decision that she knew was irrational and made it anyway. She kept working. She worked while the patrol climbed. She worked with the deliberate focus of someone who has compartmentalized the danger entirely, who has put it in a box and closed the lid, who is operating on the absolute certainty that the work is more important than the threat. Every few minutes she would look up, track the patrol's progress, calculate the time she had remaining, and go back to the work. At 200 meters, she could hear them talking. At 150 meters, she was 3 connections away from a functioning transmitter. At 100 meters, 2 of the lead fighters stopped and pointed in different directions, and she understood from their body language that they had reached a decision point about which way to continue. One of them was pointing toward her position. The other was pointing along the ridgeline away from her. One connection. She needed one more connection. The fighter who had been pointing toward her said something to the other. The other one shook his head. There was a brief heated exchange. The second man's argument, whatever it was, won. Both fighters turned and moved along the ridgeline away from her. She made the final connection. She keyed the transmitter and sent. The signal was weak. She had built this from spare parts that were old and degraded, and she was operating it at the absolute edge of its range. But it was consistent, and it was on a frequency that she knew was monitored, and it carried a coded identifier that any American signals analyst would recognize as a reconnaissance unit emergency beacon. It would be heard. Whether it would be acted on that was still a question she couldn't answer. But she had done something she had thought was impossible 6 days ago. She had built a voice in the silence. She had reached through the mountain and the distance and the enemy and the assumption of her own death and said, "I am here. I am still here. Come and find me." She sat in that old position, with the crude transmitter in her hands, with the patrol receding along the ridgeline below her, with 2 broken ribs and a jaw that needed proper stitching and food supplies that were going to run out within 24 hours. And for the first time since the ambush, she let herself believe something she had been afraid to believe. She let herself believe that someone was going to hear her, not because she had given up control, not because she was done fighting, she was nowhere close to done fighting, but because the belief was no longer irrational. She had done the work. She had survived the first week. She had made herself impossible to ignore. She had forced the enemy to double their resources against her. She had transmitted twice on monitored frequencies. She had built a beacon from pieces that weren't supposed to work together. She had earned the right to believe it. The mountain was cold. The pain was constant. The food was gone. She sat there in the dark in an old position that someone had built for watching a valley that hadn't changed in 100 years. And she breathed through the pain and she listened to the silence. And somewhere below her, the enemy was regrouping. And somewhere far away in a facility full of people watching screens and listening to frequencies and looking for anomalies in the noise, a light had come on. A signal that shouldn't exist, coming from a location where they had been told no American was alive. And one analyst, a woman who had been doing this job for 11 years and who had learned to trust the things that didn't fit, had pulled off her headset and walked down the hall to find her supervisor. "Sir," she said, "you need to hear this." Rachel didn't know about that moment. She couldn't know about it. She just sat in the dark and held the transmitter and breathed, and waited to see if the thing she had decided to believe in was real. The analyst's name was Sandra Kowalski, and she had been awake for 19 straight hours when the signal hit her board. She almost missed it. The transmission was weak, barely above the noise floor, the kind of signal that automated systems flagged as probable interference and moved on from without a second thought. But Sandra had 11 years of listening to frequencies that other people ignored, and she had developed a sense for the difference between random noise and noise that was trying to say something. It was not a technical skill. It was closer to intuition, the kind that only develops when you have spent enough years failing to trust it and learning from those failures. She pulled off her headset. She listened again through the speakers. She ran the signal through the enhancement filter twice, and then she walked down the hall. Her supervisor was Colonel Dennis Hartwell, a compact, methodical man who had the particular quality of becoming very still when something serious was happening. She found him at his desk, reviewing a stack of reports, and she said without preamble, "Sir, you need to hear this." He looked up. He read her face. He stood without asking a question and followed her back to her station. She played the transmission. The voice was strained, controlled, precise. The words were clear enough through the enhancement, and the identification number 337 Alpha Niner was the kind of detail that made Hartwell's expression go very flat and very careful, which Sandra had learned meant he was taking something seriously. "That unit identifier," he said quietly. "Third reconnaissance, sir. The convoy that was hit 8 days ago. The KIA list includes a Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter, reconnaissance specialist." She paused. "That's her identifier." Hartwell was already reaching for his phone. "Get me SOCOM," he said. "Right now." The call lasted 4 minutes. Sandra sat at her station and listened to her supervisor's voice travel through the register of calm professional authority into something more urgent, and then into the particular careful stillness of someone who is being told They are dealing with a situation that is more complicated than they understood going in. He hung up. He stood for a moment with his hands still on the phone. There's a problem, he said. She waited. The KIA designation for Carter was filed by her convoy commander. It went through the chain. It's been 9 days. If we go back and say we have a live signal from inside that search grid, we're not just opening a rescue operation. We're opening an investigation into why she was listed as dead without confirmation. Sandra looked at him steadily. Sir, with respect, that's not my problem. My problem is that there's an American soldier transmitting from inside an active enemy search operation, and we have a recording of it. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. No, he said finally. It's not your problem, it's mine. He picked up the phone again. 800 miles away, in a forward operating base that smelled of diesel fuel and dry heat, a special operations team was in the middle of a mission briefing for a completely different operation when the orders changed. The team leader was a chief warrant officer named Daniel Cross, 12 years in Delta Force, and he had the kind of face that told you very little about what was happening behind it. He listened to the revised orders with that face. He asked 3 questions, received 3 answers that clearly did not satisfy him, and then he dismissed his team from the original briefing and called them back 10 minutes later with a new set of maps on the table. Change of mission, he said. We've got a possible American in the search grid from the 3rd Recon Convoy ambush 9 days ago. There was a silence in the room. One of his team members, a sergeant named Perez, who had been in the unit for 6 years, said possible? Signals intercept. Voice identification, 2 separate transmissions 9 days apart from inside the enemy search perimeter. 9 days, another voice said. Behind that line? Alone? That's what the signals say. Perez leaned over the map. What's the terrain look like? Cross told him. Another silence. Longer this time. Who is she? Perez asked. Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter, 30 years old. Reconnaissance specialist, secondary and signals intelligence. Cracked ribs, confirmed from initial blast assessment before she went off the board. No weapon confirmation, no supply confirmation. Perez looked at the map for a long moment. Then he said, and she built a transmitter. That's what Signals is telling us. The second transmission was on different equipment than the first. Different signal profile. Somebody assembled something out there. The room was quiet in a different way now. The kind of quiet that comes when a group of people who are professionally difficult to impress are being impressed against their will. What are the rules of engagement for the search operation? Cross asked the intelligence officer in the corner. Enemy has approximately 90 fighters deployed in the grid. They've been there 9 days. Reward issued for her capture alive. Capture alive, Cross repeated. Yes, sir. Cross looked at his team. His team looked back at him. In 12 years, he had learned to read the specific quality of silence his people produced when they had already made up their minds about something. We leave in 4 hours, he said. Rachel had been running on empty for 2 days when everything accelerated. The food was gone. The ibuprofen was gone. The morphine was gone. She was operating on water and the particular grim momentum that takes over when the body has exhausted its emergency reserves. And the only thing left is the decision, made somewhere deep below conscious thought, that stopping is not an option. Her ribs were bad. She knew this with clinical certainty because she had assessed herself the way she would assess any casualty, without sentiment, without denial. The fractures had shifted slightly during the last sustained movement, and she could feel the specific grinding quality that meant the bone ends were not sitting cleanly. She was not getting pneumonia yet, but the risk was real and increasing. Her breathing was shallower than it should be, which was her body's automatic response to the pain of deep breaths, which was exactly the wrong response because shallow breathing was how you got fluid in your lungs. So she made herself breathe deeply. Every hour, 15 minutes of deliberate deep breathing, sitting still, working through the pain with the controlled focus of a woman who understood that this particular discomfort was the cost of staying alive. She was in her 3rd day without food when the enemy search operation made a move she hadn't anticipated. They split. Until now, the search had operated as a unified force, rotating patrols, centralized communications, predictable patterns that she had been able to read and exploit. But on the morning of the 10th day since the ambush, Yashi watched from her position and counted the vehicles separating into 3 independent groups, each taking a different axis, each moving with a speed and decisiveness that told her someone had made a decision about strategy. She understood immediately what had changed. They had a better fix on her. Not her exact location if they had that, They would be converging instead of spreading, but a better picture of her operational area. Her transmissions had given them something. Not enough to pinpoint her, but enough to narrow the search zone. She had been inside a box for 9 days. The box had just gotten significantly smaller. She had two choices. She could stay in place and become invisible again, which was her strongest skill, but which was becoming harder to maintain as her physical condition deteriorated. Or she could move aggressively, decisively, in a direction that would take her through the gaps between the separating search groups before those gaps closed. Neither choice was safe. Both choices had a version where she survived. She did the math in the time it took her to drink the last of her water, made her decision, and moved. She moved through the gap between the northern and central search groups at a pace that cost her more than she had. Every step was a negotiation between what her ribs were willing to permit and what the situation required, and she was losing that negotiation badly by the time she had covered the first kilometer. But she kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a door she had decided very firmly not to open. She was 2 kilometers into the movement when the shot hit the rock 6 inches to her left. She dropped and rolled without conscious thought, pure training taking over before her brain had processed what had happened, and she was behind cover before the sound of the shot reached her. Her body was already answering the question. Her mind was still formulating where had it come from. What angle, what distance? The angle of the rock strike told her high ground, above and behind, roughly 200 meters, which meant she had walked through what she thought was a gap between two search groups and discovered that the gap was not a gap. The enemy had placed a static position exactly where she had calculated there was no one. She had been anticipated. She lay flat and breathed through her ribs and thought with the focused speed of someone who has been in bad situations before and knows that the first 30 seconds after contact are the ones that determine whether there are any seconds after that. The sniper had missed. That was the first fact. At 200 meters against a moving target in difficult terrain, a miss was not impossible, but it was also not random. Either the shooter had misjudged her movement or the shot had been intentional. A warning, they wanted her alive. She had not forgotten that. A second shot hit the rock above her head. Closer. She felt the fragment sting her forearm, not a warning. The shooter was adjusting. The first shot had been the rangefinder. The second was the correction. She had approximately 4 seconds before the third shot was adjusted enough to be accurate. She moved left, fast, through the pain, around the boulder and into the broken terrain beyond, and the third shot hit exactly where she had been lying. She heard shouting from above, not one voice, several. The static position was not a single shooter. There were at least 3 of them, and they were calling her position to the search groups on the radio. The box had just collapsed entirely. She ran. Running was the last thing her ribs wanted her to do, and the only thing the situation permitted. She ran through terrain that was trying to kill her, independently of the people also trying to kill her. And she ran with the specific, desperate focus of someone who is doing the math in real time and finding the numbers very close to 0. She could hear them behind her now. Not individual voices anymore, a gathering sound. The particular noise of multiple people converging on a single point, which was her, which was where she was and where she was trying very hard not to be. She cut sharply right, down a slope that was steeper than she should have attempted in her condition, and the momentum of the descent nearly took her off her feet twice. She caught herself both times on her hands, tearing the skin on the rock, and kept moving. She needed to get below the shooting position. She needed to get into terrain where the high ground advantage inverted, where the people above her couldn't see down effectively, where she could use the broken cover of the lower ground. She made it to the valley floor and kept running. And then she heard something that stopped her more completely than any shot. An engine. Above the valley from the south. The specific sound of rotor blades cutting air. She pressed against the rock wall and looked up through the narrow strip of sky above her and saw a helicopter flying low and fast, and it was not flying the search pattern of an enemy aircraft. It was flying the direct, purposeful line of something that knew where it was going. It was flying toward her position. The question the enormous everything depends on, this question was whose it was. She had no signal mirror. She had no smoke. She had no way to mark her position that wouldn't also mark her position for the people currently 20 seconds behind her. She had her rifle. She looked at the helicopter. She looked at the pursuit behind her. She looked at the helicopter again. And she did something that every rational calculation told her was a terrible idea. She stepped out into the open. She stood in the middle of the valley floor, in plain sight of everything and everyone, and she raised her rifle above her head with both hands not aimed, not threatening, but visible. A signal. The oldest signal there is. I am the one you are looking for. The helicopter banked. It turned toward her position. And from behind her, she heard the sound of the pursuit reach the valley floor. Cross was in the lead aircraft when his spotter called out the figure. Movement valley floor, single individual, rifle raised. Not firing. Cross had the binoculars already. He looked. The figure was in bad shape. He could see that even from altitude. Moving wrong. Holding the rifle wrong. Not the way someone holds a weapon when they're threatening, but the way someone holds a heavy object when their arms are at the limit of what they can do. That's her, he said. You can't know that from mine. That's her, he said again. Take us down now. His pilot started the descent, and Cross was already talking to his team. Hot extraction, valley floor. We have pursuit multiple. She's got people on her. Suppression on my call. We go fast and we go clean. Rules of engagement? Perez asked from the second aircraft. Protect the package, Cross said. Everything else is secondary. The two helicopters came in low and hard, and the world below them became very loud very fast. Rachel heard the suppression fire begin from the aircraft and felt the change in the air around her. The pursuit behind her had stopped moving forward, had gone to ground under the covering fire, and the valley floor was suddenly a different kind of dangerous than it had been 10 seconds ago. A helicopter settled 10 meters in front of her, rotors still turning, and a figure was out of the door before the skids fully touched the ground. He was running toward her. He was wearing American kit. He was saying something she couldn't hear over the rotor noise, but she could read his body language, and his body language said friendly, "Come to me, move now." She moved. He reached her and got an arm around her before she had fully registered what was happening, and she felt his strength taking some of her weight, and she became aware for the first time in 10 days of how completely exhausted she was aware of it, the way you only become aware of something when someone else finally shows up to share it. "Carter," he shouted over the noise. "Yeah," she said. "Can you move?" "I've been moving for 10 days, she said. "I can move." He almost laughed. She could see it on his face, the specific surprise of a man who came expecting to find someone barely alive and found someone still talking back. He got her to the helicopter, and she was inside, and Cross was pulling the door shut, and they were lifting, and the valley floor fell away below them. She looked out through the window and saw the enemy fighters in the valley, pinned down by fire from the second aircraft, visible for the first time as discrete individuals, instead of the general threat she had been managing for 10 days. They looked smaller from up here. They looked like the problem they actually were: serious, dangerous, instead of the enormous and incomprehensible pressure they had felt like from inside. She looked away from them. Cross was on his radio, reporting the extraction, and she listened to his voice with the strange detachment of someone who is transitioning from one reality to another and hasn't fully arrived in the new one yet. The words were familiar call signs, coordinates. Stead reports the language of her own world, the language she had not heard directed at her in 10 days, and it felt both completely normal and completely surreal to be inside it again. Perez leaned across from the opposite seat and handed her a water bottle. She drank from it without speaking. He handed her a ration bar. She ate half of it and stopped her stomach. After 10 days of near-nothing, wasn't ready for more. He watched her with the careful attention of a soldier assessing a casualty. She met his eyes. "How?" he asked, meaning her injuries. "Ribs. At least 2 cracked, maybe 3. Cut on the jaw, needs stitching. Everything else is superficial. Pain management? Ran out of morphine 4 days ago." His expression didn't change, but something moved behind it. 4 days. Ibuprofen before that. Then nothing. She looked at the ration bar in her hand. "What I could really use is more of this." He gave her another one without a word. Cross finished his radio call and turned to look at her. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with the specific evaluative attention of a man whose entire professional existence was built around accurate assessment of situations and people. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said. "Sir, we're approximately 40 minutes from the FOB. Medical team is standing by." He paused. "Is there anything time-sensitive we need to know before we get there? Any intelligence you collected that has a shelf life?" She looked at him. She thought about the 10 days. The patrol patterns, the command structure she had partially reconstructed from intercepted communications, the supply cache location, the secondary positions on the ridgeline, the radio frequencies, the timing of rotation cycles. She thought about all of it and started talking. She talked for 37 of the 40 minutes. Cross listened without interrupting, and the intelligence officer who had been sitting silently in the back of the aircraft was typing on a tablet the entire time, getting every word down. When she paused to breathe or to think, he waited. He did not hurry her. He did not ask leading questions. He simply listened with the total attention of someone who understood that what he was hearing was the operational output of solo reconnaissance inside a hostile search operation, which was information that had a value he couldn't fully calculate yet. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You mapped their entire search operation, he said. It was not quite a question I had time, she said. You intercepted their radio traffic. Partial. Enough. You accessed their communications vehicle. Once. Briefly. He looked at her with that careful, evaluating expression. And you built a transmitter from old parts you found on a ridgeline. The components were there. I knew what to do with them. Cross was quiet again. Behind him, through the window, the mountains that had tried to swallow her for 10 days were receding into the distance. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. The convoy commander who called your status. What? Her expression didn't change. What about him? His report said he had confirmed visual on your vehicle, that there were no survivors from the blast. He didn't come back to look, she said. I was 2 miles behind in the ravine. He pulled out under fire, which I understand. He called my status without confirmation, which I don't. That's going to matter, Cross said carefully. When this gets reported, I know, she said. Is there anything you want me to include in my initial report? Anything about the sequence of events from your perspective? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about his voice on the radio, cold and certain and completely wrong. She thought about 9 days of surviving what he had decided she couldn't survive. She thought about what the investigation would look like and what it would cost and who would be sitting in rooms answering questions before it was over. Tell them what happened, she said. Exactly what happened. I don't need anything added, and I don't need anything softened. Tell them she was alive when they left and she found her own way back. Cross nodded slowly. The helicopter began its descent toward the fob, and Rachel felt the change in pressure in her ears and breathed through it and looked at the floor of the aircraft and allowed herself, for the first time in 10 days, to feel the full weight of what she had done. Not pride, not relief, not even anger, though the anger was there, somewhere underneath everything else, waiting for her to have the bandwidth to feel it properly. What she felt in that moment was simply the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer force of decision for longer than any person should have to. She had made a choice back in that ravine on the first night. She had chosen not to be what Marcus Webb had decided she was. She had chosen to be something else, something that didn't have a clean name, something that lived in the gap between what's possible and what the math says should happen. The aircraft touched down. The medical team was waiting. And Rachel Carter, whom her own command had declared dead 10 days ago, walked off that helicopter on her own 2 feet. She walked slowly, and she walked with her jaw set against the pain, and the medic who came to meet her reached for her arm to support her, and she let him, because she had also learned in those 10 days the difference between needing help and being defeated by needing it. The compound around her was loud with the organized activity of a forward operating base doing what it did, engines, voices, equipment, the constant motion of people with things to do and places to be. She had forgotten what it sounded like, or maybe she had never fully heard it the way she heard it now, as something that meant she was back inside the world she had been fighting to return to. She stopped walking for 1 second only. She looked back at the mountains in the distance, the mountains that had sheltered her and punished her and tested her in ways she hadn't known she could be tested. Then she turned away from them and walked into the medical bay. She had things to do. The medical bay at Forward Operating Base Kestrel was not a quiet place under normal circumstances, and the arrival of Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter made it considerably less quiet. The senior medical officer on duty was a major named Patricia Okafor, and she had been in military medicine for 16 years, which meant she had seen the full spectrum of what combat did to human bodies. She had learned early in her career not to let her face show what she was thinking when she was doing an initial assessment, because patients read faces, and patients who were already frightened didn't need the added information that the doctor examining them was concerned. She let her face show nothing when Rachel sat down on the examination table. But she was concerned. The rib fractures were worse than Rachel had assessed from the inside, 2 confirmed breaks, and a third that had cracked but not separated, all on the left side, and the positioning of one of the brakes was close enough to the lung cavity that Okafor ordered a chest x-ray before she did anything else. The cut on Rachel's jaw had partially closed on its own, but had done so incorrectly, which meant Okafor was going to have to open it again before she could stitch it properly. Rachel's hands were torn up deep abrasions across both palms from multiple falls on rock, and her body weight was down far enough that Okafor immediately ordered an IV for fluids and nutrition. The x-ray came back clean, no pneumothorax, no fluid accumulation. The lung was intact. Okafor let out a breath she had been holding since the examination started. "You know how close this was?" she said to Rachel, not accusingly, but with the directness of someone who needed the patient to understand the actual situation. "I know," Rachel said. "Another 48 hours with that rib position and you would have been looking at a puncture risk every time you moved aggressively." "I know," Rachel said again. Okafor looked at her for a moment. "You knew that out there, yes. And you kept moving anyway." Rachel met her eyes. "What would you have done?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her suture kit and started working on the jaw. "I would have done exactly what you did," she said quietly. "And I would have been terrified the entire time." "Yeah," Rachel said. "Me too." The suturing took 40 minutes. Rachel did not ask for additional anesthetic after the initial injection, even when Okafor could see from her expression that the deeper passes of the needle were hitting nerve endings the lidocaine hadn't fully reached. She sat still and let it happen, and stared at a point on the wall across from her. And Okafor worked as quickly and as carefully as she could, and neither of them said anything for most of it. When it was done, Okafor wrapped Rachel's ribs properly, the kind of wrapping Rachel hadn't been able to do for herself in the field, and started the IV line in her right arm. She prescribed a pain management protocol that was aggressive enough to actually work and explain the next 72 hours in the specific practical terms that she had learned patients retain better than clinical language. "You need to sleep," she said at the end. "Not rest. Sleep. Your body has been running on cortisol and stubbornness for 10 days, and it needs to shut down." "There are people I need to talk to first," Rachel said. "There are people who want to talk to you." Okafor corrected. "That's different. They can wait. One of them is from SOCOM." Okafor crossed her arms. "SOCOM can wait too." Rachel almost smiled. "You want to be the person who tells a SOCOM colonel he needs to wait?" "I've told generals to wait," Okafor said without blinking. "Colonels are easier." She won. Rachel slept for 6 hours, and when she woke up the compound outside was in the different quality of darkness that meant early morning, and she lay still for a moment and listened to the sounds of the FOB and let herself understand again that she was back. The room she was in was small and utilitarian, and the most comfortable thing she had been inside in 10 days. She looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully, because the ribs were still a constant presence, but more easily than she had breathed since the first night, and she thought about what was coming. Because something was coming. She had known it from the moment Cross asked her about Marcus Webb on the helicopter. She had known it from the particular way he had phrased the question, not accusatory, not leading, but careful in the way that people are careful when they understand they are handling something that has institutional consequences. Marcus Webb had filed a K report without confirmation. That was a fact. The investigation that was coming was also a fact. And what Rachel said in that investigation, how she said it, what she chose to include and what she chose to omit was going to matter in ways that would outlast the mission, outlast the FOB, outlast the war. She thought about this for exactly as long as it took her to sit up, which was slower and more painful than she wanted it to be, and then she thought about what she wanted for breakfast. Some things could only be carried one at a time. The first person she saw when she came out of the medical bay was Perez. He was sitting against the wall outside, not quite asleep, with his rifle across his knees and a coffee cup in his hand, and when he heard the door, he opened his eyes and looked at her with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had decided he liked her and wasn't bothering to conceal it. "You're supposed to be sleeping," he said. "I did sleep. 6 hours isn't. It's 4 more than I got in any single stretch for the last 10 days, she said. "I'll take it." He stood up, which told her he had been waiting for her specifically, and handed her the coffee cup. It was still warm. She drank from it and felt something in her chest ease that was not the ribs. "Cross wants to see you," he said. "When you're ready." He said no rush, but he's been in his office for 2 hours. "So, not no rush," Perez agreed. She handed him back the cup. "Is he going to tell me something I don't want to hear?" Perez was quiet for a half-second too long. "That's what I thought," she said, and started walking. Cross's office was a converted container unit, and he was standing when she came in, which she read as deliberate a physical acknowledgement that she was not being called in for discipline, that the power dynamic in this conversation was not the standard one. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He sat across from her. "How are the ribs?" he asked. "Okafor says I'll live." "Good." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm going to tell you what's happening, and I'm going to tell you all of it because you've earned the right to hear it directly instead of in pieces. Fair?" "Fair," she said. "The investigation into your KA designation was opened 18 hours before we extracted you." SOCOM went directly to the Inspector General's office when Kowalski's signals intercept was confirmed. "Webb has been relieved of command pending the investigation. He's been ordered to provide a full written account of his decision to call your status without physical confirmation." Cross paused. He's lawyered up. Rachel absorbed this without visible reaction. "Of course he has. The convoy's second-in-command, a lieutenant named Ferris, has given a statement. He says Webb gave the Kai a call over Ferris's objection. Ferris wanted to send 2 soldiers back to confirm the vehicle status, and Webb overruled him." She looked at the table. She thought about a lieutenant she had never particularly noticed during the mission, quiet, young, careful, who had apparently done something quietly important when it mattered. "I didn't know that," she said. Nobody did. Ferris waited until the investigation opened to say it. He didn't want to report it informally and have it disappear. She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to have a hard time after this." "Probably," Cross agreed. "That's his choice to live with." He made it. She nodded slowly. "What do they need from me?" "A formal statement. Your account of the sequence of events from the ambush to extraction, with specific attention to what you heard on the radio before the convoy departed. The IG will take the statement they want to do it here, before you're transferred, which means they want it today or tomorrow." "Today," she said. He looked at her. "Okafor will have something to say about..." "Today," she said again. "I want it done." Cross held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The intelligence you gave me on the flight back, the patrol patterns, the frequency data, the supply cache coordinates. SOCOM ran an operation against 3 of those positions last night." She went still. "All 3 were confirmed active. The cache you identified had been restocked since you accessed it. We recovered equipment and material that's going to take the analysts a week to work through." He paused. "The secondary position you marked on the ridgeline, the one you said the patrol used as a rest point, had a fighter in it when our team went in. He was captured. He's talking." Rachel said nothing. She was thinking about 10 days of watching, 10 days of cataloging, 10 days of turning the act of surviving into something that looked like intelligence work, which was what it had been. She realized now what it had been all along, even when she hadn't had the bandwidth to frame it that way. "The operation you ran out there," Cross said carefully, "whether you intended it to be an operation or not, the intelligence product you developed is going to have consequences that extend well beyond the mission you were originally sent on." "I was watching because I had to know where they were," she said, "so I didn't walk into them." "I understand that," he said. "I also understand that you then used what you were watching to access their communications vehicle, disrupt their supply chain, and build a transmitter that got you extracted." He let that sit for a moment. "Rachel, that's not survival. That's something else." She looked at him directly. "What is it?" "It's the kind of thing that changes what happens next for you," he said, career-wise, assignment-wise. Another pause. "If you wanted to." She understood what he was saying. She had understood it from the moment he said it. And she sat with it for a moment, the shape of what was being offered, the door that was being opened, and she felt the complicated weight of it. 10 days ago, she had been left for dead by a system that had decided she wasn't worth the risk. Now that same system was sitting across from her and recognizing what she had done in those 10 days and offering her something in return. She understood the irony. She did not find it funny. But she also understood that organizations were not monolithic, that Webb's failure and Cross's offer existed in the same institution simultaneously, and that choosing to engage with one did not require her to forgive the other. "Let me get through the IG statement first," she said. He nodded, "Of course." She stood, then she stopped. "The analyst who flagged my signal," she said. "Kowalski. What about her?" She should know it worked. Whatever they do or don't do with the rest of this, she should know that her decision to walk down that hall made the difference. Cross looked at her for a long moment. "I'll make sure she hears that." The IG statement took 4 hours. The investigator was a colonel named Susan Marsh, compact, precise, with the specific quality of attention that came from a career spent listening to people tell their versions of events and learning to hear what was underneath the version. She had a recorder and a legal pad and a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but simply professional in the way that professionalism, at its best, is a form of respect. She began at the beginning and she let Rachel go at her own pace, which was faster than Marsh had expected, but not so fast that anything was being glossed over. Rachel told it the way she had decided she was going to tell it completely, factually, without editorializing, without emotion that wasn't already built into the facts themselves. She described the ambush. She described the radio message. She described the sound of the engines leaving. She described finding herself alone in the ravine with broken ribs and a cracked locator beacon and 60 rounds of ammunition. She described the 9 days that followed. Marsh stopped her at several points with specific questions, always precise, never leading. When Rachel got to the part about Webb's voice on the radio, "She's dead. Mark it, we move now." Marsh's pen stopped moving for a half second and then started again, which was the only indication she gave of any internal reaction. When Rachel finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I want to make sure I understand the timeline correctly," she said. "Sergeant Webb made the KA call within how many minutes of the ambush?" "Based on what I heard on the radio, approximately 8 to 12 minutes. "And the physical distance between your position in the ravine and the convoy at the time of the call?" "Approximately 2 miles. "He could not have confirmed your status from that distance?" "No." "Did he attempt to raise you on radio before filing the report?" Rachel thought about this carefully because it was a question that mattered, and she wanted to answer it accurately and not from anger. "My radio was damaged in the blast. I couldn't transmit or receive. But based on the fragment of the call I intercepted, there was no attempt made to contact me before the designation was filed. He stated I was dead." He didn't ask. Marsh wrote for a moment. Then she looked up. "Is there anything else you want to include in this statement? Anything that you believe is relevant to the investigation that I haven't asked about?" Rachel thought about Lieutenant Ferris, who had objected and been overruled and waited for the right moment to say so. She thought about what it had cost him to do that and what it was going to cost him going forward. "Lieutenant Ferris objected to the call in real time," she said. "I wasn't aware of that until this morning. It should be noted that someone in that convoy did the right thing and was overruled. This investigation is about what went wrong. It should also be about what went right." Marsh looked at her with the first personal expression she had shown in 4 hours. "Noted," she said, and wrote it down. The transfer orders came through that evening. Rachel was being moved to Bagram for additional medical treatment and then stateside for recovery and debriefing. She had 48 hours at Kestrel before the transport, which was 48 hours more than she'd had any right to expect 10 days ago, and she used them with the same deliberate intentionality she had used every hour of the last 9 days, not frantically, not desperately, but with purpose. She slept again, properly this time, 8 hours, and woke without the specific taut readiness that had been her default for so long that she hadn't noticed it until it was gone. She ate real food, carefully, the way Okafor had instructed, small amounts, frequently, letting her system rebuild its tolerance rather than shocking it with volume. She sat with Perez for an hour and talked about nothing important, which was exactly what she needed, and he seemed to understand this without being told. She called her mother. That call lasted 40 minutes, and she did not tell her mother everything. She told her she was safe. She told her she was coming home. She told her she was sorry it had taken so long to be able to call. Her mother's voice on the other end of the line did something to Rachel that the 10 days in the mountains had not managed to do. It cracked something open in her chest that she had kept very carefully sealed, and she had to breathe through it the same way she breathed through the rib pain, slowly and deliberately, and without letting it become something she couldn't manage. "Are you hurt?" her mother asked. "A little," Rachel said. "I'll be okay, Rachel." Her mother's voice had the specific quality that mothers' voices get when they know their child is downplaying something serious. "Are you really okay?" "Yeah, Mom," she said, and meant it. "I really am." It was on the second evening that Cross came to find her again. She was sitting outside the medical bay in the hour before the sun went down, and he came and sat beside her without preamble. And they were both quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they've already said the important things, and what's left is the space around them. "Webb's going to face a formal board," Cross said. "I know. His lawyer is arguing extenuating circumstances. Combat conditions, incomplete information, command pressure." Rachel looked out at the compound. "He had incomplete information because he didn't try to get complete information. That's what the board will decide." "I know," she said. "That's why there's a board." Cross was quiet for a moment. "You're not angrier than you sound." She thought about this, honestly. I'm angry, she said. I'll probably be angrier later, when there's room for it. Right now, she paused, looking for the right word. Tired, the real kind. The kind that has nothing to do with sleep. He nodded slowly. The offer I made yesterday, he said. The assignment question. You don't have to decide now. You have time, I know. But I want you to know that it's real. It's not this isn't institutional guilt when trying to compensate for what happened. What you did out there is genuinely something that people spend careers trying to develop, and most of them never get there. She looked at him. You mean the part where I was left for dead with 2 broken ribs and no radio and no food and no support? I mean the part where you turned that situation into an intelligence operation, he said quietly. I mean the part where you thought strategically when thinking strategically required more than most people have. She was quiet for a moment. I thought about quitting, she said. Out there, I want you to know that. It wasn't I didn't just power through it like some machine. There were moments where I thought about stopping, where stopping seemed like the only thing that made sense. What stopped you from stopping? He asked. She thought about the ravine on the first night, the sound of the engines leaving, the moment she had given herself 2 minutes to feel the betrayal and then decided to put it away. She thought about the cold rock under her hands and the stars above the mountain and the 50 stars she had counted before she made herself move again. I decided it wasn't over, she said, just that. I decided that what he said about me wasn't true, and then I acted like I believed it until I did. Cross was quiet for a long time, Rachel, he said finally. For what it's worth from someone who has been doing this for 12 years, what you did out there is one of the most remarkable things I have ever seen in this job. She looked at him steadily. It might be more remarkable than it should have had to be, she said, because someone made a decision that it should never have been necessary. Yes, he said simply. It is, and it was. Both things are true. She nodded. They sat in silence for a while longer as the light changed. The compound around them moved through its evening routines, the shift changes, the equipment checks, the particular contained energy of a military installation that never fully slept. She had been part of this world for years. She had never felt it the way she felt it now. From the outside and the inside simultaneously, with the specific double vision of someone who has been outside the world that sustains them and has come back to it changed. She thought about the IG investigation. She thought about Webb in front of a board. She thought about Ferris and what his honesty was going to cost him and whether he understood yet that it was the right kind of cost. She thought about Kowalski in her signals facility, 11 years of learning to trust the things that didn't fit, walking down a hall with a recording that changed everything. She thought about all the people who had made small decisions that added up to her being here, sitting outside this medical bay with properly set ribs and a sutured jaw and coffee that was terrible and hot and exactly what she needed. The transport out was scheduled for 0600. She went to bed at 2200 and lay in the dark and breathed carefully and let the quiet be what it was, not the hostile quiet of the mountain, not the waiting quiet of a person who has to be alert to everything, but the simple quiet of someone who has permission finally to rest. The ribs ached. The jaw pulled at the sutures when she moved her face. Her hands were stiff and painful under the bandages. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in 10 days, she slept without listening for the sound of someone coming. The transport lifted at 0600 exactly, and as it banked and climbed and the faux bow fell away below her, Rachel looked out the window one more time at the mountains. Not the specific mountains where she had spent 10 days, those were out of sight from this angle, behind a range of ridgelines that had no idea what had happened on the other side of them. But mountains like those, mountains that looked the same way every mountain in this country looked enormous, indifferent, ancient. She had gone into them as one thing and was coming out as something she didn't have a complete name for yet. That was fine. Names could wait. Perez was across from her again, on the transport back, and he was reading something on a tablet and not trying to talk, which was exactly right. At some point during the flight, without making any kind of decision about it, she fell asleep in her seat. When she woke up, they were an hour out from Bagram, and the light outside was different, and the mountains were gone. She looked at her bandaged hands in her lap. She thought about a woman named Webb who had made a decision. She thought about a woman named Kowalski who had made a different decision. She thought about a lieutenant named Ferris who had said something true even when saying it was hard. She thought about herself in a ravine, in the dark, with broken ribs and a dead beacon and 60 rounds of ammunition and the decision she had made about what the next moment was going to be. The transport flew on, and Rachel Carter, 10 days dead and very much alive, looked out the window at the sky and thought about what she was going to do next. The debriefing at Bagram lasted 3 days. Not 3 sessions. 3 full days, with different teams rotating in and out of the room: intelligence analysts, medical personnel, psychological evaluators, legal officers connected to the IG investigation, and twice, a 2-star general named Whitfield who said very little, but listened with the particular quality of attention that told Rachel he was the one who actually mattered in the chain of people she was talking to. She told the story the same way every time, not because she had rehearsed it, but because it was true, and true things don't change based on who's asking. She described the ambush, the ravine, the radio message, the convoy pulling out. She described 9 days in the mountains. She described every operational decision she had made and the reasoning behind each one. And she answered follow-up questions with the same flat precision she had used with Colonel Marsh back at Kestrel. The intelligence analysts were the ones who kept stopping her, not to challenge her to verify. They had maps spread across the table, and they were cross-referencing her account against the operational results from the 3 strikes. Cross's people had run on the locations she identified. Every time she described a position or patrol timing or a radio frequency, at least one person in the room would look at something on their screen and make a note, and the notes were accumulating in a way that told her the intelligence she had collected was holding up against every check they could run against it. On the second day, one of the analysts, a young captain named Torres, who had been quiet for most of the previous session, leaned forward and said, "Sergeant Carter, the secondary ridgeline position you identified, the one you said the patrol used as a rest point. What about it?" she said. "The fighter we captured there, the one Cross mentioned. He's given us information on a weapons transit route that we didn't have. A route that's been active for 2 years and that we've been trying to locate for most of that time." Torres paused. "The information that came from that capture is going to affect operations in this region for the next 6 to 18 months. Rachel looked at him steadily. "I watched that position for 4 days," she said. "I watched it because I needed to know when it was occupied, so I didn't accidentally walk into it." "I understand that," Torres said. "I'm telling you what came out of it." She nodded slowly. She was thinking about 10 days of watching and cataloging and moving through the dark, and how none of it had been intended as an intelligence operation in the way Torres was describing how it had been, at its most fundamental, the activity of a woman trying not to die, and how those two things, surviving and gathering intelligence, had turned out to be the same activity, conducted with the same tools, producing the same results. General Whitfield, from his chair in the corner, said, "How did you know to watch the way you did?" She looked at him. It was the first question he had asked in 2 days. "I didn't know to," she said. "I watched because watching was the only safe thing I could do during daylight. You can't move in daylight in a contested area with active search operations. So you stay still, and if you're staying still, you might as well be looking at something, and if you're looking at something, you might as well be learning from it. Most people in your situation would have been focused entirely on escape," Whitfield said. "Escape to where?" she said. 200 kilometers through terrain that's actively being searched. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't overpower them. The only advantage I had was that they didn't know exactly where I was. So I used that." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. He had a face that had been doing this for a long time, listening to people described as made under pressure, and she could see him processing something, filing something, making a judgment of his own that he wasn't sharing yet. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, and went back to his notes. On the morning of the third day, before the final debriefing session, Rachel had a visitor she hadn't expected. She was in the small room she'd been assigned for the duration of the debriefing, basic, functional, the kind of space that said you're important enough to have your own room and not important enough for the room to be comfortable, when there was a knock at the door. She said, "Come in," and the person who came in was Lieutenant Ferris. She recognized him immediately, though she had barely spoken to him during the mission. He was younger than she remembered, or maybe he just looked younger out of combat kit, in the standard uniform of someone reporting to a rear area facility. He was holding his cover in both hands, in a way that suggested he had been working up to this for a while. "Sergeant Carter," he said. "Lieutenant." She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. There was a silence. He was clearly going to say something and clearly wasn't sure how to start it, so she let him take his time. "I wanted to tell you in person," he said finally. "What I told the EG, I wanted you to hear it from me directly instead of through the investigation. I know what you told him, she said. Cross told me. Another pause. I should have said it sooner. I should have, when it was happening, I should have pushed harder. I objected, but I didn't push hard enough. She looked at him carefully. He was carrying something that was heavier than the situation required, the specific weight of someone who had been living with a decision they weren't sure was the right one, and who had finally made the choice and was now dealing with the aftermath. You pushed as hard as a lieutenant can push back against a senior NCO in the middle of an active engagement, she said. You objected on the record, you were overruled, and when the time came to say what happened, you said it accurately and completely. That's what the right thing looks like when the options are limited. I drove away, he said. His voice was flat but not empty. I was in that vehicle and I drove away. You followed orders in a combat situation, she said. That's also what right looks like, when the order isn't unlawful on its face. He told me you were dead. He told everyone I was dead, including me, more or less. She paused. Lieutenant, you did not abandon me. Webb made a call without confirmation, and you followed that call, and when the truth came out, you told it. That's the end of your debt to this situation. Do you understand me? He looked at her with an expression that was complicated and young and very human. How are you not angrier, he said. At all of it. At him. At the system that let it happen. She thought about this question, which was the same question Cross had asked in different words. She thought about the answer she had given Cross and whether it was still true. I am angry, she said. I will probably be angry about this for a very long time. But anger and function are not the same thing, and I've spent the last 10 days choosing function. It's become a habit. He was quiet. What happens to you now, she asked. Career-wise, he almost smiled, but it didn't quite make it. I've been told I'll be reassigned after the investigation closes. New unit. Fresh start, they're calling it. And unofficially, he looked at the floor. Unofficially, I'm the officer who reported his convoy commander. That follows you. Yes, she said, it does. She looked at him steadily. It should also follow you that you were right. Both things travel together. He stood to leave, and at the door he stopped and turned back. Is it true, he said, that you built a transmitter? From old parts on a ridgeline? More or less. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in something closer to wonder. We were told you were gone, he said. We all accepted it. Even the people who felt wrong about it, we accepted it. I know, she said. How did you not accept it? She thought about the ravine. She thought about the cold and the dark and the sound of the engines disappearing and the 2 minutes she had given herself to feel everything that needed to be felt before she decided to move. Because accepting it required me to be dead, she said simply. And I wasn't. He left. She sat for a moment in the quiet room and breathed through her ribs and thought about everything that was still coming: the stateside transfer, the recovery, the formal board proceedings against Webb, the months of debriefing and documentation and institutional processing that would be the bureaucratic tale of 10 days in the mountains. All of it was going to happen. She had no control over most of it. What she could control was how she moved through it. She had learned something in those mountains that she was still in the process of understanding fully. It wasn't a lesson about survival. She had known how to survive before. It was something more specific than that. It was a lesson about the relationship between what other people decide about you and what you decide about yourself, and which one of those decisions actually determines what happens next. Webb had decided she was dead. He had decided it with authority and certainty and the weight of rank behind it. He had filed paperwork on it. He had driven away from it. And she had decided he was wrong. That was the whole story at its core. Everything else, the 10 days, the intelligence, the transmitter, the extraction, all of that was what happened when you refused to let someone else's decision about you be the final one. The final debriefing session that morning was the most important one. General Whitfield was back, and this time he had brought someone Rachel hadn't seen in the previous sessions, a colonel from Special Operations Command's Personnel Division named Harris, who had the particular careful energy of someone who had been briefed extensively and was here to deliver something specific. They went through the final review of her account, which took about an hour. Then Whitfield leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a man who had made up his mind about something. Sergeant Carter, he said, I want to talk to you about what comes next. Yes, sir, she said. The investigation into your KIA designation will conclude within the next 30 to 60 days. The board proceedings against Sergeant First Class Webb will follow. You will be required to provide testimony. I want you to know that your account as given in this debriefing is consistent and corroborated at every point by physical evidence and independent witness testimony. There is nothing in your record of these events that is uncertain or disputed. I understand, she said. What I want to address now is your career. He glanced at Harris, then back at her. Colonel Cross has submitted a formal recommendation. It is the most unequivocal commendation I have read in 22 years in this job. He is recommending you for the Distinguished Service Medal and for immediate consideration for special reconnaissance assignment at the SOCOM level. She kept her face still. I am prepared to act on that recommendation, Whitfield said. The question is whether you want me to. The room was very quiet. There are other options, Harris said, speaking for the first time. Given what you've been through, the physical demands, the psychological dimension of what happened with the KIA designation, the investigation, no one would question a decision to take a different path. Medical separation with full benefits. Reassignment to a stateside training role. Whatever you need. Rachel looked at Harris. Then she looked at Whitfield. What did Cross write in that recommendation, she said. Specifically, Whitfield picked up a folder. He opened it. He read, Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter demonstrated under the most extreme operational conditions the precise combination of tactical intelligence, psychological resilience, and strategic thinking that this command has spent decades trying to develop in its operators. She did not survive her situation. She dominated. This command would be a lesser organization without her in it. The room was very quiet again. Rachel thought about a lot of things in that silence. She thought about the first night in the ravine. She thought about moving northeast when every instinct said southwest. She thought about the signal device buried in the cache and the transmitter built from old parts and the 30 seconds of radio time that had changed everything. She thought about Kowalski walking down a hall with a recording. She thought about Cross saying she had turned survival into something else. She thought about the mountains, about what they had asked of her and what she had given and what was still left in her after all of that. I want the assignment, she said.
Whitfield nodded once as if this was the answer he had expected.
There will be a recovery period first, Harris said. Medical clearance. Standard protocol. How long? 3 to 4 months, minimum. That's fine, she said. I'll use the time. She arrived stateside on a Tuesday afternoon, and her mother was waiting at the airfield. There are moments that don't require narration. There are moments that exist completely on their own terms, that resist being described because description makes them smaller. Rachel and her mother standing on a tarmac in the flat afternoon light, holding each other with the particular fierceness of people who have been on opposite sides of something enormous and have come back together. That was one of those moments. Her mother didn't ask questions. Not right away. She had learned, in years of being the mother of a soldier, that questions could wait and presence could not, and she was present in the complete, complicated way that only the people who love you most know how to be. They drove home. Her mother had made food, too much food, the specific excess of someone who had been unable to do anything useful for 10 days and had resolved to make up for it now that there was something concrete to do. Rachel sat at the kitchen table and ate and answered the questions her mother had been holding carefully for the right moment. And the kitchen was warm and ordinary and full of the specific domestic sounds that she had not heard in months. At some point during the evening, her mother said quietly, "When did you know you were going to be okay?" Rachel thought about this. "When I decided I was going to be okay," she said, "before I knew it was true." Her mother looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Rachel couldn't fully read: pride and grief and relief, and something older than all of those, the particular emotion of a parent who understands for the first time the full depth of what their child is capable of and feels the weight of that understanding. "I raised you right," her mother said finally. "Yeah," Rachel said. "You did. The recovery took exactly 3 months and 12 days. The physical part was the straightforward part. The ribs healed on a schedule that Okafor, in a follow-up consultation, described as faster than expected but not surprising given Rachel's overall conditioning. The jaw healed clean, with scarring that was minimal and that Rachel looked at in the mirror, sometimes not with vanity, but with the specific recognition of someone reading a record of events written on her own face. The psychological evaluation was the part that people assumed would be difficult. And it was, but not in the way they assumed. The evaluator was a civilian psychologist named Dr. James Ellery, who had spent 15 years working with special operations personnel and who was not, Rachel discovered, easily surprised. He was also not interested in pathologizing the normal human responses to abnormal situations, which she appreciated. "Do you have nightmares?" he asked in one of their early sessions. "Sometimes." she said. Not about the mountains. About the radio. About hearing him say it. Webb's voice. Yes. What happens in the nightmare? I'm in the ravine and I hear him say the words and then nothing. There's no next part. In the nightmare, there's nothing that comes after. Ellery made a note. But in reality, something came after. Everything came after, she said. He looked at her. That's the distinction that matters, he said. The nightmare removes your agency. Reality gave it back to you. Your work, in here and outside of here, is to reinforce which one is true. She thought about this for the rest of the day after that session, and she thought about it on and off for the weeks that followed, because it was exactly right in a way that very few things people said to her were exactly right. The nightmare stripped away the decision she had made in the ravine. Recovery was, in a very specific sense, the work of remembering that the decision was real, that she had made it, that it had mattered, that it had determined what came after. The IG investigation concluded in the 7th week of her recovery. The findings were unambiguous. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb had filed a KIA report on Staff Sergeant Rachel Carter without physical confirmation of death, without exhausting available means of confirmation, and in direct contradiction of a real-time objection from a subordinate officer. The report characterized his decision as a failure of command responsibility with significant operational consequences. Webb was reduced in rank and given an other than honorable discharge. Rachel read the findings in her apartment, alone, on a Wednesday morning with coffee she had made herself in a view out the window of a street that had nothing to do with Afghanistan. She read every page carefully and put the document down when she was done and sat with the outcome for a while. She thought about what justice was supposed to feel like. She thought about whether this was it. She decided that this was the closest the available systems could get to it, and that the gap between what had happened and what could be formally accounted for was a gap she was going to have to carry herself, which was not fair and also was simply true. She called Cross. I saw the findings, she said. I know, he said. How are you doing with it? I'm doing with it, she said. That's the honest answer. That's a good enough answer, he said. The assignment's still open, she said. It was never closed, he said. Medical clearance came through this morning. Psych eval clears end of this week based on Ellery's report. You're looking at reporting date in about 3 weeks. She sat up a little straighter without meaning to. Where? He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's exactly where I would have asked to go. I know, he said, that's why. The new unit's first briefing with Rachel present was on a Friday morning, in a room that smelled of coffee and dry erase markers and the particular focused energy of people who were very good at very difficult things. There were 12 of them, all experienced, all with the specific quality of self-contained competence that came from years of operating in environments where competence was the price of admission. They looked at her with the evaluating attention that special operations people always turned on anyone new, which was not unfriendly but was thorough. The unit commander was a lieutenant colonel named Shaw, who had read every word of her file and the IG report and Cross's recommendation, and who introduced her to the team with exactly the amount of context they needed and nothing more. Afterward, one of the operators, a sergeant named Delgado, who had been in the community for 8 years, fell into step beside her in the hallway. So the story's true, he said. Alone? 10, actually, she said. If you count from the ambush to the extraction. And you built a radio, a transmitter. It's different. He looked at her sideways with an expression that was doing its best to be skeptical and losing. How do you build a transmitter with scrap parts in the mountains with broken ribs? Very slowly, she said, and with a lot of motivation. He laughed a real laugh, the kind that came out before the person could decide whether to let it out or not. She matched it. Welcome to the unit. Thank you, she said. Show me what you're working on. The case study on Rachel Carter's mission went into the military's survival training curriculum 14 months after her extraction. She knew it was coming. She had been consulted during the development, had reviewed the initial draft and made corrections where the account flattened things that needed texture, had pushed back on the sections that made the 10 days sound more systematic than they had actually been, because the truth was more useful than the legend, and the truth was that she had not survived because she had a plan. She had survived because she had refused to stop making plans, which was different, and the difference mattered. The first time the case study was taught to a class of reconnaissance candidates, she was not in the room. She had been invited to speak and had declined because she understood that the value of the material was the material itself, the decisions, the reasoning, the outcomes, and that putting herself in the room made it about her, instead of about the lesson, which was not what she wanted. She heard about the class from Shaw afterward. They asked a lot of questions, he said. Good questions? One kid asked how you knew the transmitter would work. What did the instructor say? He said you didn't know. You built it anyway. She nodded. That's right. The kid asked what made you try if you didn't know it would work. What did he say to that? Shaw looked at her. He said he didn't know. He said they'd have to ask you. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the ridgeline and the old components and the pain in her ribs that made every movement a negotiation and the thing that had made her pick up the first piece and start. What did you tell him? Shaw asked. I haven't told him anything, she said. I wasn't there. What would you have told him? She looked at Shaw steadily. I would have told him that you try, because the alternative is deciding it's over. And deciding it's over is the only failure that actually counts. Everything else failing, getting it wrong, running out of options, those are just problems. Problems have solutions if you stay in the fight long enough to find them. Shaw was quiet. The transmitter worked, she said. Not because I knew it would, because I built it like it was going to. A year after the extraction, a ceremony was held at Fort Bragg. It was a small ceremony, not the kind with crowds and cameras and the full apparatus of institutional recognition, but the kind with a room full of people who knew exactly what they were recognizing and why it mattered. General Whitfield was there. Cross was there. Perez was in the back row, the expression of a man who was proud and trying to look like he wasn't. Dr. Ellery was there, which surprised her. Sandra Kowalski was there, which surprised her more. She had asked for Kowalski specifically, had made one phone call to one person and said the analyst who flagged the signal should be in the room. She had been told it might be complicated. She had said she was patient but persistent, which had gotten a laugh, and eventually, Kowalski, the Distinguished Service Medal ceremony, was brief and formal, and said the important things in the language that these ceremonies used, which was not always the most precise language, but which carried the weight of institutional acknowledgement in a way that mattered, that Rachel had decided mattered even after everything. Whitfield pinned the medal and shook her hand. How does it feel? He asked quietly. Like something that took a long time to get here, she said. And like the wrong thing to say would be that it was worth it. He looked at her. What's the right thing to say? That it's over, she said, and I'm still here. He nodded. That's the right thing. Afterward, she found Kowalski in the group that was moving toward the reception. She introduced herself, which she understood was slightly absurd. Kowalski knew exactly who she was, but which was the right way to start. Kowalski was smaller than Rachel had imagined. She was in her 40s with the kind of face that had been paying attention for a very long time. You don't have to thank me, Kowalski said immediately. I did my job. You did more than your job, Rachel said. You trusted something that the automated systems dismissed. That's not the job. That's the judgment underneath the job. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. The signal was strange, she said. It didn't fit the noise profile. That's all I knew. That was enough, Rachel said. They stood together for a moment in the easy quiet of two people who understood each other without needing to explain themselves. Can I ask you something, Kowalski said. Yes. When you transmitted the first time from the vehicle, did you think anyone would hear it? Rachel thought about the enemy vehicle, the 30 seconds, the careful flat voice. She thought about what she had believed in that moment and whether belief was even the right word for it. I thought there was a chance, she said. I thought the chance was worth the risk. Kowalski nodded slowly. A chance, she said. That's all I had too. When I walked down that hall, they looked at each other, two women on opposite sides of an enormous distance who had each taken a chance on a signal that didn't fit the noise, and who had between them, with those two decisions, changed what happened to a person who was still standing here to know it. It was enough, Rachel said. She meant the chance. She meant Kowalski's decision. She meant everything that had followed from the moment a woman in a signals facility had pulled off her headset and decided that the thing no one else was paying attention to was worth walking down the hall for. She meant all of it. The morning after the ceremony, Rachel was back at work before 6. There was a briefing at 0700. There was a training exercise in the afternoon. There was a team debrief at the end of the day that was going to run long, and she was already thinking about the questions she wanted to ask and the problems she wanted to push on. She had things to do. She had always had things to do. That was the part that people who heard the story sometimes missed, the part where survival was not the end of the story, but simply the condition that made everything else possible. She had not survived in order to be someone who had survived. She had survived in order to keep going, which was what she had always been doing. which was the only thing that had ever really mattered. Delgado caught up with her in the hallway before the briefing. Heard the ceremony went well, he said. It did, she said. You look exactly the same as you did yesterday, he said. Medal and everything. Were you expecting me to look different? He thought about this with exaggerated seriousness. Little taller, maybe. I'm exactly as tall as I need to be, she said. He laughed. They walked into the briefing together. She sat down at the table with her team, her team. The words still carried a specific weight that she had not yet stopped feeling, and she opened her folder and looked at the problem in front of her, which was difficult and complex and had no clean solution yet. She started thinking about it. That was Rachel Carter, the soldier her command declared dead, who decided they were wrong, who survived 10 days in the mountains on broken ribs and 60 rounds and the absolute refusal to let someone else's certainty overwrite her own, who turned survival into intelligence, who built a voice out of silence and made it travel far enough to be heard, who walked off a helicopter on her own feet and gave her debrief and went through every institutional process the military required of her and came out the other side not diminished but clarified, stripped down to the thing she had always been, the thing no one could designate away from her, the thing that had never required anyone's confirmation to be true. Some soldiers are remembered for what they endured. Rachel Carter was remembered for what she refused. She refused to be dead when she wasn't. She refused to stay defeated when she had a single option left. She refused to let the story end in a ravine because someone with authority had decided it should. And in refusing, she wrote a different ending, not a comfortable one, not a clean one, but a true one. The kind of ending that only belongs to people who understood in the worst moment of their lives that the decision about what comes next was still theirs to make. It always had been. It always will be.